Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to our fourth Lenten speaker, Professor Michael Higgins. Remember, we're using as our theme the Models of the Church by Avery Dulles, and this week is the Models of the Church. The Church is Mystery. There's no prejudice in getting Michael here tonight. First and foremost, he's a native of Toronto. His degrees are Canadian, Toronto, and ultimately York. And he has served in a number of administrative positions at Catholic universities in Canada, from the Maritimes to the Prairies. So he has done a number of things. Now he is at Sacred Heart University in Bridgeport. Have you left that administrative position? Yes. And I was full professor. He's written extensively. He's used on television and on the radio. He's won numerous awards for all of that. He is a specialist for those who might be interested in Henri Nouwen and, dare I suggest and put on the table, Thomas Merton. So he goes across the board with numbers of other things. His latest book, to be published in the sheet, if you're interested after the talk, you can get it, is being published by Paulus Press. Impressively Free is the title of it. Henri Nouwen as a Model for Renewed Priesthood. Remember, the book that was the most famous, that many of us were introduced to Nouwen, for all of us, was Wounded Healer, which was the basis and goes forward. So Michael has done this with Kevin Burns, another Canadian writer. He's got lots of stuff, and I'll let you learn as I've been learning from him. So without further ado, Professor Michael Higgins and the Church as Mystery. Michael.
There we go. Can you hear me? The acoustics in this room are astounding. I don't even know if we need microphones, but they tell me we do, so I'm going to use the microphone anyway. I was asking Ed if he would put a copy of the flyer for the new book out there. The reason for that is not that I'm into shameless self-marketing. I am. But the primary reason are publishers now in the United States and indeed in Canada are notoriously cheap. Nobody does the work anymore. Publicists don't exist, or they exist only in limited numbers. And so authors are expected to promote their own work, which is a bit of a setback, really, because I mean, one of the few perks you get is somebody else actually promotes your books, and now we have to promote our own books. So whenever I'm giving lectures or talks anywhere, my publisher says, make sure you bring all these things with you and distribute. So they're there. You're welcome to take one with you. If you're interested, you can order the book. If you're not interested, don't tell me. I'm very thin-skinned. So just take it, smile, and then rubbish it as you're walking out the door so that I don't know. Well, I'm going to talk tonight about communion and, mystery and sacrament, that's what Ed told me to talk about. And I'm going to bring up some interesting figures in the process. I was telling my wife, I'm what is called the Distinguished Professor of Catholic Thought. They give you the title Distinguished when they don't know what to do with you anymore. So they say, all right, now you're distinguished. So it really frees you up to write books and do research, which is a nice gig after 40 years in university life, to be able to actually do what you're supposed to be doing in university, and that is actually writing books and doing research. I divide my time between Fairfield, where the university is, and Guelph, Ontario, where my wife lives. So every weekend I fly home back to Toronto and then go on to Guelph. And she was asking me, what are you talking about in Troy? And I said, well, mystery and sacrament. She said, well, don't make it too obtuse. Try and make it concrete. And that's a challenge, because if you look at the great systematicians and theologians talking about mystery and sacrament, Avery Dulles is an exception in this. It is dense, particularly Ronner. So I'm going to take us through some aspects of what we mean by mystery, some aspects of what we mean by sacrament, and then give us some concrete instances from this marvelous Irish mystic poet who died in 2007 by the name of John Moriarty, who writes beautifully about sacraments in the concrete, with a great capacity for storytelling and for narrative, which seems to be a genetic, passed on Irish trait. What do we mean by mystery? Well, you know, for many years I wrote a weekly column in a newspaper, the Telegraph Journal, called Mysteries and Mystics. And it was a hell of a job, because it meant reading 52 books a year outside of what I would ordinarily be required to read in order to meet the rubrics. Now, mystics is pretty clear. What do you think the mysteries were? Mystery novels, whodunits, P.D. James and Ruth Rendell, and their international equivalents. That's a genre, a mystery. Another wonderful example is when I was covering Vatican synods, Roman synods for the international press. When we would go to the press conferences and we would ask the synod fathers or the prelates who were there a question they couldn't answer, or more likely a question they didn't want to answer, they would say, "Oh, it's a mystery." So the mystery was the drop box for, I don't want to talk about this, right? So it's a mystery, right? So mysteries are a literary genre, right? They're whodunits, and they fit within they're detective novels, right? And it's a term, a grab bag of a term, which means basically, I have no idea, or I do have an idea and I just don't want to talk to you about it, right? And so we'll call it a mystery. But then there's the mysterium fidei. It always changes when you put the Latin phrasing, right? But we call it the mysterium fidei. Oh my God, now it's really important. It's got a mystique about it because it's in an ancient language. But it's also got a reality to it, of course, which supersedes and operates outside the narrow orbit of the mystery novel and the language of mystery as evasion. So what do we mean when we talk about mystery? And what do we mean when we talk about the church as mystery? Well, Pius XII talked about the mystical body. Mystici corporis was perhaps his most, how should I put it, his most dense encyclical on the mystical body of talking about the church as the mystical body. And it came out during the war. So 1943, I think, 1942, 1943. And, of course, his history has been embroiled in controversies as a consequence of his alleged silence during the war, and some of his more controversial encyclicals, Humani Generis and whatnot, that came after, and Dei Fronti Spiritu, which came at the end of the 1940s, which opened up the Catholic world to biblical scholarship. Okay? And then at the same time, not too long afterwards, he wrote an encyclical really suggesting, in very strong terms, monogenetism, meaning there was an Adam and Eve. Not metaphorically speaking, but literally speaking. And put a kind of, didn't straitjacket the work that he had done in the earlier encyclical, but made it a little more complicated. And it was a complicated papacy, but the mystical body, the notion of the church as a mystical body is an important one to keep in mind. Mystical is not the same as mystery, of course, but they do have a common root word. John the 23rd, with the encyclical, well, not the encyclical, but the document Lumen Gentium, although let me see now, when does Lumen Gentium? Lumen Gentium is not the first document. The first document is the document on the liturgy. I think it's the second document. So John 23rd was still alive. He died in 1963, you should know, but he opened the council with the first session in 1962. And many of you look like we're a noted demographic that we were around at the time of the Second Vatican Council. Anybody remember the First Vatican Council? If you do, see me later, because I got a place for you in an anno or catalog that'll make you a fortune. John the 23rd and Lumen Gentium, of course, talk about the church as the pilgrim people of God. Automatically, the use of that image suggests something very different from the mystical body, right? The mystical body is a theologically abstract term and a philosophically dense one, admired is not quite the right word, but embedded in a specific scholastic framework. The pilgrim people of God concept of the church, with its forward notion of unfolding and its sense that we're not yet at rest and that the church is very much embedded in the world, not an exceptional reality in that world, represents a shift from a high ecclesiology to a low ecclesiology, in the same way that the mystical body notion, with its emphasis on transcendence, is different from the pilgrim people of God with its emphasis on immanence. So you can see even within a 50-year time span, not even 50 years, a quarter of a century actually, time span, we have shifting images of what the church is. Now the wonderful thing about that is that the church is, if it is nothing else, fluid. It's not static. When I'm approached by various critics of Catholicism, of which there are many, most of whom are Catholics, talking about the church as a museum piece, they make a serious mistake in this, because if it was a museum piece, it would have atrophied a long time ago. The church actually does change, and it does adapt, sometimes in frighteningly subtle ways, so it doesn't look like it's changed, or in sometimes coy ways, when popes will say, as has been taught by my illustrious predecessor, when in fact the illustrious predecessor never said any such thing. Because popes want to make sure there's continuity in the teaching, that there's no rupture in the teaching. So we always say, well, I can tell you, based on how we do things in the Catholic Church, that when the occasion arises, sometime in some century, where after a council, presumably, because only a council can shape doctrine, the decision is made to allow women to be ordained to the presbyterate, you will find the church making the argument, as we have always taught. You'll say, well, wait a minute. We haven't always taught it that way, and we haven't. It's as if it's some seed in the belly of the church that blossoms later, but it's embedded there somewhere in its recesses. There's some truth in that, actually. And Newman's theory about the development of doctrine fits very beautifully within that notion that doctrine and dogma evolve. They're not static, because life evolves. When you talk about the church as having life, it's movement. Any biologist would tell you that the essential defining quality of life is movement. Movement of the cells, movement, course of blood coursing in the veins. Movement is life. Mobility is and change, they constitute life. So the church does change. Sometimes not in the way we would like it to change, or not as quickly as we would want it to change, but it does change, because it's a living structure. So the notion of the pilgrim people of God is actually a wonderfully fluid and expansive notion of the church en route, in peregrination, in a pilgrim mode, unfolding rather than just fixed, perfectly static, perfectly unshaken, a citadel on a hill, Images that unfortunately run counter to the actual life of the church and to the richness of a broken body, because that's what we are. We're not just the mystical body, we're also the broken body. Let me quote Peter C. Fan, an eminent American theologian, who has the following definition of mystery, which I think is rather nice, and he draws it from both the council and from the scriptures. He says, the church's mystery is not something left over after everything else is known, and hence obscure and dark and not relevant to us. Nor is it a series of propositions whose meaning is now unfathomable, but will be made clear in beatific vision. Rather, the church's mystery is that by which everything is known and everything is loved. It is that by which everything points to the condition of possibility of our knowing and loving. It is the horizon towards which we transcend ourselves in knowledge and freedom. This act of self-transcendence is called transcendental experience, an experience which is at the heart of human existence. It is, in other words, God as the incomprehensible. There are, therefore, not many mysteries, really. On the contrary, there is but one self-same mystery, namely God, who communicates God's self to us as Word and Spirit in the Incarnation and in grace, in history and in the beatific vision. End of quote. Now, that dynamic understanding of mystery, of course, goes some considerable way to show that we are actually encased in an unfolding mystery, that our transcendental experience, that our horizon as human beings, or as the philosophers would say, subjective existence, is not determined or limited by our temporality, that we are part of something bigger, our yearning for God. Augustine's very critical notion of desire, right? We yearn for the transcendent. We desire something bigger, deeper, more embracing than ourselves. And in the Catholic tradition, that's communion. That's communal. Okay? And it's grounded in a very deeply Christocentric theology. Jesus is at the heart of this all. This is an historical personage for whose expansive heart embraces us. Now, I work at a university called Sacred Heart. And Sacred Heart is, for many Catholics of a particular generation, redolent or reminiscent of an old-fashioned devotionalism. It was actually an 18th century French devotion, taken over very aggressively by the Irish and sentimentalized beyond any kind of recognition. As a consequence, large numbers of people find it off-putting, the Sacred Heart. But in the writings of the great French scientist and mystic Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, there was a real effort to recover the Sacred Heart as a symbol or an emblem of the expansive evolutionary quality of Jesus' encompassing love as Alpha and Omega. So the Sacred Heart is an image of cosmic embrace, the love that Jesus has for all of creation, rather than seen as a pious and individualistic devotion of limited appeal in our time. So Teilhard and others, there was a priest of the Diocese of Bridgeport who sits on our Board of Trustees and pastor of a large parish, St. Aloysius in New Canaan in Connecticut. And he gave one of the finest homilies or convocation homilies I've heard in over 40 years. Because to the graduating class of students from Sacred Heart, he wanted them to understand actually what that meant. Okay? What would they carry in their own heart? What does the Sacred Heart, the pulsing heart of Jesus really mean? Earlier on, Ed had said something about Henry Nouwen. I'm Nouwen's biographer. And there was an occasion when he was living in France at Trolley-Breuil and with Jean Vanier and Madame Pauline Vanier. And at one point, they were living together. He was living with Pauline Vanier. And she was herself very much a mystic. And Henry, he had a rather liberal sense of community living. So if he saw something in the fridge and he was hungry, he ate it. So he ate her brie, which quite ticked her off, actually. It was her cheese. So they got off to a bad relationship. But they eventually came to have great love for each other. And at one point, in order to make amends, she asked him to write a book about the Sacred Heart. But he was reluctant to do that. He said, I don't really like that devotion. That reminds me of a certain time in Dutch history. I don't want to go there. But she was persistent, and so he went back, and he went deeper into the tradition, and he wrote a lovely series of meditations on the Sacred Heart. What first to mollify her, to make up for eating her brie, but also as a sign of their growing friendship in the Eucharist. The Church as mystery, let me just get back to the topic here. The Church as mystery, then, with Peter C. Fan, is a pulsating, living reality. Okay, when we sometimes think of mystery and talk about mysterion, the Greek term from which mystery comes, we sometimes think of it in rarefied language. We think of it as ineluctable, as proximate, as something, so otherworldly and ethereal as to have no meaning for us. Fan is making the case, going to the scriptures, but also to the living, reflective tradition of the church, that mystery is an ongoing, embracing reality and speaks to our own need for transcendence. We know in our lives that we experience transcendence when we empty ourselves in love for our children, for our spouses, for people who depend on us, who come to us, who are broken. Right? In particular moments like that, you empty yourself. Now, the technical term is kenosis, or self-emptying, but it's also a form of transcendence. It's a form of leaving the priorities of one's own life in order to enter in to the priorities of the divine life. The other notion critical to tonight's reflection is the church's sacrament. And Karl Rahner, whose language about transcendence and the subject Fan actually picks up and uses his own definition of mystery, nicely summarizes what we mean by sacrament in his famous work, his great anthology, Sacramentum Mundi. And I like it. Let me just quote it for you for a minute here, because you can see when he's talking about sacrament, what he means when he talks about the church's sacrament. We all know what the sacraments are. We all know what sacramentals are. We can remember that. And we even know what a sacramentary is, right? But to know the church as the sacrament, that's a pretty novel idea for us. And yet it's one that is as old as the scriptures itself. He says, following the Second Vatican Council and the various declarations of the Magisterium, we must now realize that the most important assertions of this council on the church and its sacraments can be found in its primitive, meaning its going back to the primary source thinking. Here it is undoubtedly of decisive importance that the church is once more designated as being itself in Christ, the sacrament. That is the sign and instrument of the most intimate union with God as of the unity of the whole human race. This is again the document Lumen Gentium. The individual sacraments, therefore, are described as vital actions of the church, whose mysterious essence is to be in Christ and by virtue of Christ, the primordial sacrament. Christ is the primordial sacrament. And since the church is regarded as a personal fellowship, as you can see perfectly tonight, that of a royal priesthood sanctified and organically constituted by God through Christ and in his Spirit, this primordial sacrament takes concrete form in the individual sacraments, and through these affects its members in its receptive and mediating character, and so lives for God the Father by virtue of the holiness thus attained in its responsive character. You can see the syntax, in spite of being translated into English, is still German. So it takes a long time to get to the end of the sentence, and by which time you've forgotten what the point is. But the church as the primordial sacrament, Christ as the primordial sacrament, ourselves as agents of sacramental life. These are the points that Rahner is making. Because when we think of the sacraments, of course, we think very specifically of how, as Catholics, we have 7 of them, though that decision about 7 was fairly late in the history of the church, making its decision about what constituted 7. Actually, it's in the Middle Ages by the time they agree on 7. And they're not actually sure as to the biblical warrant, because there are debates among themselves. And then when they concretize the 7 sacraments and codify them, particularly at the Council of Trent, it's in reaction to the reform and to the radical reform that have reduced the number of sacraments to 2 or to 3. Okay? So as the Protestants were reducing the number of sacraments, we wanted to make sure that we got that 7 in there and got them permanently fixed in the Catholic imagination and in Catholic history. And those 7 sacraments are very important to consider, because the sacraments of initiation and sacraments that deal specifically with sometimes what they call alienation, meaning sacraments that deal with the anointing of the sick, and forgiveness, bringing in the alienated or those who are being alienated from their bodies. And then the sacraments of community, witness and marriage, of course, and holy orders. So there are the history of the sacraments, how they've developed, how we talk about them, again, is a wonderful reminder of the dynamic thinking within the church. We often think, okay, this has been perfectly realized and perfectly put in form, and we've always thought this way, and we know that because it's in the book of canon law, the Code of Canon Law. But the first Code of Canon Law is the creation of, I think, 1917. The only second Code of Canon Law we have is 1983. So before that, we didn't have all these laws codified. Right? So, and the thinking about what we mean by marriage, for instance, has undergone significant mutation over the centuries. And there is debate now within various circles about what to actually mean by priesthood. Is the language we use to describe priesthood and ordination, is it the language, and are the concepts as relevant now, although one is always reluctant to use that language, but does it have the same kind of generating credibility that an earlier model has? Or how are we in a different space, as it were, now, as we think about what it means to be human, the nature of gender, the debates over ontological differentiation, and a number of these other issues, some of them fairly abstract, some of them quite concrete, all of them indicating, again, that in a way, it's not that the sacraments are up for grabs, but our understanding of the sacraments changes. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of that in a few minutes. What most of us recall from the sacraments we learned in our catechism classes, right? Or in a course we took in introducing us to theology at the university. And that was the way we discovered what the sacraments were. And of course, we had the sacraments, right? And sacramental theology itself was always seen, by comparison to historical theology and to systematic theology or dogmatic theology, was always seen as a kind of a weak sister. Okay, well, we have the sacraments and we have prayer and whatnot, but, ascetical theology we used to call it, and now we call it spirituality. They're over there, but the really core things are dogmatic, systematics, and historical theology. So sacramental theology often got short shrift. Not any longer. Because in an age that despairs of the meaning or does no longer understands the meaning of sign and symbol, the validity of that form of seeing or perception has become ever more necessary. In a hyper-rational age where the only thing that really matters are how we measure, quantify, and weigh things that we can look at, things that are tactile, things that could be measured, so that as you go up the grid in the employment scale or through professorial appointments in the university or in the business community, when you go up the steps to higher positions as in the executive ranks and whatnot, we measure everything according to particular matrices. We weigh things. We quantify everything. We are a society obsessed with quantification. As a consequence, we've eclipsed qualification, if you like. And I don't mean qualifications in terms of professional apparatuses and apparati or whatever that we have that we can use to bolster our case for promotion. I'm talking rather about the quality that cannot be assessed by using the kinds of measurements and standards that have become normative in our culture. And that introduces a whole different way of seeing things, right? For poets and for people who operate outside of the Enlightenment model, this kind of fresh seeing is often realized in the work of visual artists. Ed was telling me about a Fred Varley painting that he has on his stairwell, and how it gives him great consolation when he looks at it, because it invites him into a deeper world, a world of interiority and reflection. And I was mentioning to him that when Henry Nouwen was writing I think his most famous book now, on the prodigal son, he sat for countless hours in front of Rembrandt's Prodigal Son at the Hermitage in St. Petersburg, letting the painting speak to him before he could write about it. Because this is all about fresh seeing, you see. It's a new epistemology. It's a new way, a different way of looking at the world outside the budget, the budget line, or some graph, or what other instrument that we use to weigh and measure things in our culture, our economy, everything that we do. Sign and symbol and metaphor and image, they don't work that way. They invite us into a different world of perception. In fact, they help us to cleanse the doors of perception. This is how the mystics think. Rahner once wrote that in the 21st century, to be a Christian, you'll have to be a mystic. In other words, you're going to have to be open to a different horizon, a different way of looking at the world, a different way of being in the world, a different way maybe of even thinking about the world. The sacraments help to root us in a different, more imaginative way of connecting. They're not just rituals or gestures. Each sacrament, its enactment, is a form of incorporation. You become part of the history. You become part of the communion. You become part of something bigger than yourself. The rite is not just a rite of initiation, if you like. It's a rite of incorporation. And so these symbols have enormous importance because they celebrate the imagination. In the history of spirituality, the role of the imagination, of course, is paramount. And perhaps the most dramatic instance of it is found not in the arcane writings of the mystics of the Paradise tradition or the Carmelite tradition or the Via Negativa or whatever, as important and as significant as they are, but in a much more mundane, if you like, Ignatian tradition. Okay? How the Jesuits pray. Right? And since the 1960s, the Jesuit order opened up the exercises, first of all, to specific religious men and women outside the Society of Jesus, and then eventually to everyone, every Catholic, and then eventually to any Christian. You could have your own spiritual director, and you can go to Jesuit or Ignatian retreat houses, and you'll have your what is called an exercitant, because you're going through the exercises. If you go through the 30 days or 40-day exercises and whatnot, and you will have a director, a companion who will take you along that way. That's, again, only since the 1970s, not since the time of Ignatius. It's what Ignatius wanted, but the subsequent generals of the order didn't go that way. They went a different way. What is key to understanding the exercises is the imagination. Ignatius forces you to do what is called compositio loci. Go into it and imagine the place. What would Jesus have said? I want to give you a wonderful example that I heard recently. Well, not recently. It was last year during the Triduum. And it was a Jesuit priest. And he was talking about this, the woman opening the door, the porter, if you like, to let Peter in. It's in one of the Passion narratives. And she recognizes him. And she lets him into the inner court. All right? So this Jesuit took that one line, and he doesn't see it as judgment. Because if it was judgment, she would have said, he is one of the disciples. And they would have arrested Peter. No. She lets him in the door to be with the one he loved and betrays. So he imagines what this is, because the scriptures don't fill it in. The scriptures are quite sparse with these. They're sparse narratives. They're invitations for us to fill it in. And it is the imagination that fills in the stories. Right? What was it like to be Barabbas? One of the great novels that won a Nobel Peace Prize, the Nobel Laureate Prize in Literature was Per Lykvist, Norwegian novelist, who imagines what it was like to be Barabbas after Barabbas is freed. Like we don't know. Or Colm Tóibín, the Irish writer, who talks about, in his Testament to Mary, he talks about what was it like being Mary at the foot of the cross. And he imagines that she was quite annoyed, that she was dragged into this. Right? And then when a couple of the disciples or the evangelists come to speak with her and to tell her, this is the narrative, this is the spin you're going to give, she resents that. Now, Tóibín may be wrong theologically, but what he's doing imaginatively is inserting us into the narrative. It's what scholars call the sacramental imagination, and it's one of the fruits of the Catholic genius. We have a lot of things that aren't going right in our church. We have structures that are decaying, and we have leadership in various areas that is moribund. We have scandals that remind us of the worst excesses of the time of the Medicis. So we got all this, right? And sometimes when you live in this in the muck and mire of scandal, you forget the light. You forget the luminous points. You forget the translucent witnesses and geniuses, the saints, the mystics, the women and men of prayer, often the ordinary ones sitting beside us whom we know. They'll never be canonized. They'll never have any office in the church. But by the way they live their lives, they're the genuine goods. So the reality of the church, the mystery of the church, is not embodied or limited to its structures. If it was, there'd be no point in remaining in it. If we remain in the church simply on the basis, well, the structures have enormous capacity to reform, they don't often reform. If you look at the history of the church, it's particular mystics and particular saints that drive it to reform. Pope St. Francis, Francesco da Bernardone, in the 13th century drove a charism of reform that no other religious leader either conceived of or was an agent for the realization of. He even brought Innocent III along, and he actually talked to Saladin, the Sultan. Francis was bold. Francis of Assisi was a bold visionary. One of the reasons why I think the current Pope, by taking the name of Francis, has picked up many of the characteristics or qualities of the product of Umbria and gives it that kind of witness expression in our own time. So the sacraments are a way of fresh seeing, new seeing, helping us to become reacquainted to the mystery that is the church itself. Let me give you a couple of examples. There's a wonderful collection, a reflection called Finding God in a Leaf, the mysticism of Laudato Si, by an Irish Jesuit by the name of Brian Grogan. And it consists of 40 simple but beautiful meditations on the Pope's encyclical on the environment and our planet as our common home. And what he does is he looks at the encyclical through the lens of mysticism. But the mystical lens is a lens grounded in the sacramental imagination, because that's how you talk. Let me give you an example of it. He talks about the precious book of creation, pages 22 to 23. He says, "We used to think that spirit and matter were opposed to one another, but Laudato Si stresses that the spirit is active in all matter in order to bring it home to God. Evolution is now widely accepted among Christians as valid, with the added religious dimension that it originates not of itself, but from the Spirit. The Spirit has been playing in creation," there's the image, "over some 14 billion years, kneading and molding it like clay, creating the most beautiful and extraordinary diversity of every species. The Pope himself says, God has written a precious book, whose letters are the multitude of created things present in the universe. No creature is excluded from this manifestation of God, from panoramic vistas to the tiniest living form. Nature is a constant source of wonder and awe. It is also a continuing revelation of the divine." That's the sacramental imagination speaking. Okay? That's looking at creation. He sometimes talks about it in tender terms. Nature is God's tender caress, right? The precious home. Okay? It's a language which is affective, a language which is maternal, a language which is embracing. These are images. Okay? These are images. These are symbols. They are signs, and they bring us to a deeper awareness. They bring us deeper into the meaning of the sacraments themselves and to the fundamental mystery that is the mystery of the church. I want to give you another example. I mentioned earlier about this John Moriarty. Moriarty died in 2006, the age of 69. He's probably going to be, as time unfolds, recognized as one of the most important voices in the history of Irish spirituality over the centuries. He had a very integrating vision, bringing nature, evolution, profound transcendental experience on a mountaintop or in a lake, his own anguish, his own mental collapse as he works through the negative way with John of the Cross in order to reintegrate himself, all this kind of stuff, an extraordinary life. He was briefly a professor at a university for 6 years, and then he left and returned to Ireland, returned to the island of Inishbofin, and then became a gardener. For the rest of his life, he was a gardener, and he worked in the fields, and then he would write his books of an evening. And his books have now are increasingly becoming works of great, indeed classical insight, drawing together in a very reflective way the various threads around interreligious dialogue, the relationship of science and religion, the importance of the imagination and narratology, we call it now, but storytelling, just simply storytelling, building up the communion, all right? And doing this from a really rather obscure part of southwestern Ireland, mostly in County Kerry. Well, in a book called Serious Sounds, published not too long before his death, he has a positively splendid image of the sacraments itself. This is a wonderful book, and the book called Serious Sounds is not an updating, it's a personalizing of the sacraments. So he talks about each of the sacraments in a way that draws you into the personal narrative. So it's not something that's dry and antiseptic and abstruse. It's a living thing. It's a story, okay? It's a sign. It's an invitation to enter into something deeper. And he does that. I'll give you two examples of it to show you what I mean. And one of them is when he's talking about the Eucharist. Okay, the sacrament we all celebrated, or many of us celebrated just shortly before. And he's in a chapel on the island of Inishfallen. Inishfallen is in County Kerry on Loch Lina. And it's a small island, it's absolutely gorgeous, and it has an ancient chapel and an ancient abbey, which at one time was a seat of great learning in the first millennium, okay? Or the beginning of the second millennium. So it straddles a few centuries, but they're ruins now. You have to get there by boat. You pay €10, and a boatman takes you over to the island. And you're on the island with, I think, 39 deer, because they have to register the deer. So I went over, and it's a very, very small island. I didn't see one deer. I don't know where they were. They had decided, well, one Canadian was too much, and they got on the boat and went back to the mainland themselves. I don't know. I didn't see any deer. I don't know how you could miss 34 deer, but we did. But the island was a wonderful invitation to enter into the imagination and history. So he talks about it. He's in this chapel, and he's sitting there, and he's thinking about the Eucharists that used to be there. The sounds with which God called the universe into being, and now in this little chapel, the sound of water being poured and the sound of bread being broken, these are the sounds of that same universe being redeemed, even echoed over the centuries, the sound of the bread being broken and of the water being poured. It was terrible because, heard in another way, these were the sounds of the universe turning back as upon an axle toward its divine source. Christ was the axle, the living axle, and the turning upon him was screeching agony. At home in North Kerry, when we were young, we would sometimes hear such a screech on the road outside our house. If Mag Mahoney or Dan Quinn or Moss Hartnett hadn't greased the axle of their cart or their horse cart, then the turning of the wheels upon it would issue in screech after screech after screech all the way from Po to Moivan. Okay? So look at it. This is what the sounds are making. What does he do with those sounds? Brings them to a new level of awareness. They're simply the screeching sounds of an axle. But Jesus is the axle at the heart of the world. See how his mind, how his imagination moves us sacramentally from the mundane to something that becomes infused with a higher meaning. No different, I have often supposed, was Christ's axis mundi screech on Golgotha. The minister spoke the Eucharistic prayer. We receive, saying, as the bread and wine were given to us, Lamb of God, who take away the sins of the world, have mercy on us. Lamb of God, you who take away the sins of the world, have mercy on us. Lamb of God, you who take away the sins of the world, grant us peace. So just that one example on this ruin of a chapel, an ancient place, but a sacred place. People aren't there anymore, but the imagination brings them there. The sounds of water and the sounds of bread breaking are the sounds of the Eucharist that reverberate over the centuries, the pulsating sound of redeemed humanity, indeed of creation. That's Eucharist. That's the sacrament. And that's the sacramental imagination entering into that experience of sacrament. Later on, he has this wonderful passage. I love this because it is a nice way to think of the sacraments rather than somehow or other, it's just extensions of the arm of the church. So we have these 7 sacraments. You go through them, throughout your life, you'll have 6 of the 7 maybe. Unless you remain single, then you have only 5 of the 7. Or you die without benefit of religion and you don't have the rites, so you only have maybe 4. So it's a calculation, right? But that somehow misses the point of all this, right? So here's what he says. There is our natural genome, and then there is the Christian genome of sacraments. Our Christian genome takes us into and through a sequence of astounding transitions, the blueprints for which are not to be found in our natural genome. Think of our final transition as Meister Eckhart, the great Rhine mystic, has described it, and we see that what the Christian genome has in mind is our further and final evolution. Our evolution in the end from that in us which evolves. Observing the way in which custom can become second nature, Pascal, the great 17th century mathematician and mystic, wondered whether nature itself is but a first custom. Assuming for the moment that this is so, it mightn't be entirely fantastical in a science fiction sort of way to imagine that our Christian and our natural genomes might one day merge. This meaning that our further and final evolution would then be genetically encoded. This meaning that in emerging with it, second nature would become primary nature. All in all, I disagree with Nietzsche when he says that Christianity is the greatest calamity that has so far afflicted humanity. And I will not be putting my shoulder to the cannon carriage wheel of one of Voltaire's revolutionary ambitions, expressed as an incitement to destruction in 2 words, écrasez l'infâme, destroy the infamy. Voltaire meant by the infamy the church. The Chinese have it that the sage will more often than not be found walking not ahead of humanity, pioneering a way forward, but behind it, picking up the wonderful things it leaves behind it in its flight into a future that might well turn out to be what so many of our futures have been, costly failures. Starting in the early autumn and continuing into winter, the ice cap spread south from the polar regions. Obviously, he was writing before climate change. Seals, caught up in this advance, have to keep breathing holes open in the ice. After a 15-minute dive or so seeking for food, they must come up into these breathing holes and draw breath in them. This is what the Christian sacraments are. They are breathing holes. I sometimes think that these seals' breathing holes are what we breathe transcendentally. Without such breathing, something essential to our humanity dies, or rather, something essential in our humanity doesn't come to life. The breathing holes in the ice, which allows the seals to inhale the oxygen they need before they go back down under, are the sacraments in our lives. They bring us into the transcendent. They give us oxygen to carry on, if you like. They refresh us. That's what air does, right? It refreshes us. It restores us. It recreates us. It connects us with something larger than ourselves. So the sacraments are not only a sign of the mystery of the church, they are the public manifestation of the church as communion, as communio, or koinonia. How we come together as people of prayer, a people of history, a people of custom, but a common people yearning for a common end. Let me just quote this for you from Power and Peril, which I think kind of nicely encapsulates this pilgrim people of God mystery that is the church, but also linking it very directly with what we mean by spirituality in our own time. In his review of the 1999 retrospective of the French symbolist Gustave Moreau at New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art, critic Peter Skodal observed that millennium or no millennium, everybody knows that we are in transition from a former world which bores us to a coming world which numbs us with uncertainty. Our clear sign of this uncertainty and its attendant anxiety can be found in the significant rise of interest in spirituality. People are drawn in increasing numbers to explore the many complex and exciting areas of interconnection between spirituality and other areas of human endeavor and meaning. The new frontiers of elites have opened up. The new frontiers of knowledge so boldly pioneered by scientists and the new technology elites have opened up grand vistas of challenge and concern for the devout and the questing and the curious. But there are dangers in this, as we all know. A spirituality that is not communal, historical, or theological with justice as part of its very definition becomes a spirituality of toxins. We become isolated in ourselves. We become insulated in our despair, or we become entirely pietistic and individualistic in the way we conceive of our spirituality. Just think of the number of manuals. I remember a number of years ago I was invited to give a lecture on spirituality. A number of university presidents gathered in Washington. I was a university president myself at the time. And university presidents we're often just bureaucrats. And we have to deal with complex things that need to be done. But the possibility to do any serious visionary thinking and whatnot are pretty limited by the demands on your management skills. So having an opportunity to bring them into a discussion, at least for a short period of time, about our own interior lives, about our own spirituality, I decided to see, okay, well, because they're all come different disciplines, astronomy, astrophysics, finance, whatever the disciplines they had before they became presidents, although now they tend to all come from the same education administration background, which is not a good thing for the universities, frankly. But anyway, they were gathered, and I was trying to find a point of entry into this and to say, okay, how do we do this? So I went to the local big bookstore in Washington, that's right in Union Station there, the train station right downtown. And I couldn't find a spirituality section per se. They had a different name for it. But eventually I found it, and it was a whole shelf for it, 2, 3, many shelves, whole aisles of spirituality. But they weren't spirituality in any sense in which a Christian could have done it. Certainly there was no Teresa of Avila anywhere, or John of the Cross, or even Thomas Merton was missing. But there were books on how to deal with the spirituality of your pet, how to deal with the spiritual life of the animal world, and countless other things that just struck me as quirky, if not actually kinky, to tell you the truth. But they were of enormous interest to people because there's a voracious appetite for manuals or handbooks, what we used to call an enchiridion, a kind of a manual that you carried with you to help you get through your prayer life or get through your life. So now we have manuals, what they call them, Chicken Soup for the Soul would be one of them, the dummy books, right? All kinds of manuals to tell you how to deal with your investments when you retire, how to raise your children. You usually read that book after you've raised the children. And usually the people who write the book don't have children. So there is always a deep displacement between reality and the text. Textbooks to tell you how to enhance your sexual life. Textbooks to tell you how to get a sexual life. Textbooks to deal with all kinds of different things. And then you have manuals on the spiritual life, as if somehow if you took a seminar or you took a weekend or you spot in some spirituality guru, you're going to meet the next stage of your life. But it doesn't work that way. Spirituality doesn't work that way. It's not an acquired commodity. It's not a purchased item. It's not a certificate you get at the end of a weekend. It's a life lived in wisdom and in suffering and in insight. It's a long process. Okay? And it's like the saints, right? If you identify yourself as spiritual, I've achieved a certain level of spiritual self-awareness, well, you're going to be a little suspicious, right, of the person's credentials. It's like saying, I'm humble, right? And I do wonderfully humble things. By the very admission that you work in such a way, of course, you undermine your humility. So what do you do? I mean, Merton has this wonderful poem, Zen poem, in which he talks about how we possess knowledge, but wisdom possesses us. And the same thing applies to spirituality. And spirituality is intimately linked with mystery and with sacrament. My point is this. The special genius of the Catholic Church is to be found in this profound sense of communion. We're not atoms, isolated, existing by ourselves, doing our own things, disparate and alone. We all know, many of you may see it with your grandchildren or your grandnephews or indeed with your children, how attached we are, indeed addicted, many of us are, to social media. And we've discovered, McLuhan told us this decades ago, and we didn't listen to him, that it will disincarnate us. Okay. There'll be false community, but there'll be no communion. The rising number of suicides among university students is a perfect illustration of that. Universities now, for a plan, we have to strategically plan what we're going to do with our resources for first-year students when they arrive on campus. Because they come with all their all their equipment, their computer is relatively harmless, but their cell phones, their Facebook connection, their Instagram, and all of this, and they move into a world which is disincarnate. So we have to design the residences where you encourage community, so that they have to come and occasionally be with each other, right? Because they live in pods. Right? It takes a while to break them out of that, to help them to be tactile, help them to be comfortable in their skin, all right? And to spend less time with Facebook and more face time with other human beings. This is a real challenge. The strength of communion is that you're not isolated. You're not alone. And the sacraments are not private possessions. The sacraments are community-based, right? You witness each other's marriage, and the priest, as a representative of the church, is the witness to your marriage, but you marry each other. Okay? Your baptism, you don't baptize yourself, is an initiation into community. Each one of the sacraments is a mode of community building. Each one of it draws not only upon imagination, but on the sense of ourselves as part of a community. So to develop a Catholic or a Christian spirituality which is integrated and moves us forward and out of the kind of insularity and isolation we can often find ourselves in, the kind of terrible atomization that we experience, and we see it often in our society, is a spirituality that leads us out back again to the notion of the transcendental experience that we each have. The transcendental experience is not an experience that turns inward. That's not interiority. Right? The transcendental experience brings you out in order to enter more deeply into the other and discover the depths of your own interiority. It's a much more complicated, dynamic process. It's not withdrawal. Spirituality is never withdrawal. Spirituality is a deeper entering into. And the ways and means in which we do this into the sacramental life of the church and in the mystery of the church is to be found in how we respond to these things. There is a marvelous quote, and I'll end with this. A spirituality of resistance is not dismissive of the past, hampered by a crippling nostalgia or self-occupied and insular. There are other spiritualities, post-institutional and some with a touch of the antinomian, that offer a desperate challenge to a desperate church in a sometimes desperate time. The classicist and church historian Mary T. Malone nicely frames such a spirituality in the life and witness of the author of a famous medieval book called The Mirror of Simple Souls by the Beguine, Margaret Porta, executed by the Inquisition in Paris in the year 1310. This is what Mary Malone says. One of Marguerite's beliefs was that the two churches exist. Holy Church the less is the church based on reason. Holy Church the greater is the church based on love. And it is the latter's mission to try to persuade the little church to move from reason to love. It was a radical vision, and it did not win her many institutional friends. But is it not, in a sense, the reality of the situation? Without in any way decrying the agenda of the institutional church, has it not always been the reality that it is love which will heal and renew, not putting theory into practice? Has it not always been the reality that it is an evangelical vision that leads us to the edge of the abyss, not conciliar doctrine, not canon law, however sublime? Perhaps this is the time for Marguerite, the time for standing back in wordless awe at the mystery of unmanifest nothingness, rather than discoursing in calculated and predictable proof texts, which in the end do not feed the soul. End of quote. What feeds the soul is the imagination. It may not be quite divine symmetry, but nonetheless it is apposite to return to the opening of this chapter that I quote from Peter Skidow's article on Gustave Moreau, in which we can see expressed something of the dangerous emptiness represented in the life of Marguerite and tentatively argued for in the prose of Malone. And here's this great quotation. Something to take away from tonight. If you forget everything else that I've said tonight, you've already erased it from your memory because you want to be able to sleep and you want to get the echo of my voice out of your head. Keep this line in mind. Don't we pine for spiritual enthusiasm in our present era, an era which is sick with speeches? We're sick with speeches. We need to be renewed. The sacraments are agencies of renewal. They're conduits of grace. They're the breathing holes that bring us transcendence. They're moments that allow us to empty ourselves into something bigger. That something bigger is the primordial sacrament, the church, Jesus. That something bigger is the incomprehensible mystery that is God. Thank you.